John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we're reading Hellblazer number 85. And just a little catch up before we get into it. Last issue was a one-shot by Jamie Delano that told the story of why Chaz owes John. And basically it was because John killed Chaz's mom for him. And that sounds pretty harsh, but Chaz's mom was pretty terrible. And technically, he didn't kill Chaz's mom. He killed her familiar, which was a chimpanzee named Slag. And her and the chimp were connected in spirit, I guess. So when the chimp died, she also died. But John kind of knew that was going to happen. So, he did kill the chimp knowing that it was going to kill her. So that was cool to get a little context on their relationship. But first things first, with issue 85, we got the cover. We see a smoking John Constantine is holding a baby, and there's a bright light coming from in front of Constantine on his left side. Kind of looks like there's some kind of holy light just to the left of the cover. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Eddie Campbell with art by Sean Phillips. And this is the first time we've had a writer that wasn't Jamie Delano or Garth Ennis writing. And I believe Eddie stays on for about 12 issues or so, so we'll call this like his little mini run that he did. And we've definitely seen Sean Phillips because he did all the stuff with Jamie Delano with The Dead Boy's Heart, which is in issue 34 or 5, something like that. And as we turn to the first page, we see a white man who looks like he's in his late 40s, early 50s, and he's sitting up in bed and he looks terrified. And it seems like he's talking with someone in the room, but we can't see them. And he's saying, "I'm not mad. This is happening. It's all coming unstuck like a Dolly painting. All dripping clocks and mustachioed masturbators prancing up the high street in broad daylight. I tell you, it's real. The donkey pope's putting the Inquisition back in charge of things. They're cooking people's feet over acetylene burners just to keep in practice. You gotta hear me." And we turn the page and we see John is the person who's standing in front of him. And John is standing off to the side of the bed. And it seems like the man is in a trance or something where he's just saying all this nonsense to whoever will listen. So John's narration says, "This should have been a doodle. John," she says, "can you come over and exorcise the demon out of my Uncle Arthur? He's been in a trance for a week. Comes out of it occasionally to gibber away in a madman's voice." And John's narration answers her saying, "Okay, there's nothing on the box tonight anyway." And while we get this narration, we see Uncle Arthur is still saying stuff, and I'll just read it because it's all crazy. And he's saying, "In Japan, a bloke evolved backwards overnight. By morning, he was crawling towards the Pacific on all fours." And we see John is staring at Uncle Arthur as he's talking this gibberish. He kind of looks maybe annoyed or just like, why did I do this? But as he's standing there thinking, John's narration kind of fills us in how he knows this woman. So his narration says, "I've known Sam a long time. She helped me out with a trick seance I used to pull to make a dishonest crust. Dishonesty as a way of tangling people up. So I run to help." And we get a little flashback of John arriving at this house earlier this night, and Sam saying to him, "Thank God you can make it, John." And John says, "Arthur's not feeling too clever then." And she replies, "John, Arthur's a passenger in his own body. Somebody else is driving. Been that way for years. But now he's getting crazy, and he keeps saying the others are coming." And John asks, "What others?" But we don't get an answer. We just see John approach his door, and she says, "He's in his bed, John." And John says to her, "You all wait out here, and I'll get to the root of the problem then." Then we cut to present where John is standing next to Arthur's bed again, and John's narration says, "So I put my hand on Uncle Arthur's head, and he has this big, great apocalyptic vision," which is all the gibberish that we just heard him saying. And Uncle Arthur continues what he was saying about the man evolving backwards and going towards the sea. And he says, "By tea time, he was a plate of sashimi. Ah!" And then Arthur grabs his chest and he falls back onto the bed. And John rushes over to him and says, "Don't die on me, Arthur." But it's too late. As John gets to him, John's narration says, then he promptly turns his toes up. "On the touch of death, huh?" So as John stands there looking at Arthur's dead body on the bed, trying to figure out what to do next because his niece is standing just outside the door, and now he's got to figure out how to give her the bad news. So John lights a cigarette and he says to Arthur's body, "Sashimi. I had some of that in a restaurant once, Arthur. I took it home and cooked it. It tasted just like fish." Then John goes over to get his coat and he looks at the window, which is covered with blinds, and his narration says, "Explanations are a pain in the arse. It's time to leg it. Should be able to drop down from that window easily enough." But then as he pulls back the curtains, he sees there's bars on the window, and his narration continues. "Ye gods, they kept daft Uncle Arthur well out of harm's way up here, didn't they? Except he wasn't so daft at that. Been having the same apocalyptic visions myself for the last week or so." And then John thinks on some of the visions that he's had over the last week, and his narration says, "Arthur, you forgot to mention the chicken that gave birth to a human in Atlanta last Tuesday. No one knows. It ate the evidence." And we can see John is thinking of this chicken, so this is actually a prophetic vision that John had of a chicken that gave birth to a human, which then promptly ate the baby. So as John thinks what he's going to do, he starts looking around and he notices a bookcase. So he walks over to it and his narration says, "So who picked Uncle Arthur to be the prophet of doom? That's what I want to know. I'm sure I heard something once about him being psychic. Never paid much attention." Then as he looks closely at the spines, John's narration says, "These occult books would support that rumor. Geez, this one's so wicked you'd have to go all the way to the Vatican to find another copy. And it might explain how we're both seeing things. Or maybe we're both nutters. That'd explain it too." And it seems John can't really think of anything else to do, so he walks over to the door and he says, "Bugger this for a game of soldiers. I'll have to face the music." So John opens the door and he says, "Look, I'm sorry, people. Things haven't worked out." But he stops dead in his tracks, and as we turn the page, we see his friend Sam isn't standing there anymore. There are three beings just standing in the hallway. One of them looks like a ghost from the 1700s. The other is a cat person who's wearing Victorian-era clothes. And we see a woman who's sitting down, and we see a white woman sitting in a chair, and she has no arms and no eyes. And John takes this all in and says, "Oh, bloody hell." And to that, the 1700s ghost raises a glass to him and says, "You came looking for an evil spirit, Mr. Constantine. Well, here I am at your service." And we see the name of this issue is Warped Notions Part 1, The Delicate Power of Terror. So John looks at the ghost and says, "A ghost, huh?" And the ghost quotes Shakespeare to him saying, "Doomed for a certain time to walk the night, and for the day, confined to waste in the fires till the foul crime's done, and my days of nature are burnt and purged away." Then he drinks out of his ghost wine glass, and John jokingly says, "Can't be so bad, mate. You're still holding your cocktail glass." And the ghost looks at him and says, "You're right. I was jesting. I didn't come from those dark regions. That was Hamlet's father. 'Tis the nectar of the gods which I imbibe. I am Sir Francis Dashwood, or at least that was my name when I first walked the mortal plane." And John seems pretty surprised by this, and he says, "Run that past me again?" "Sir Francis Dashwood, notorious founder of the Hellfire Club, got a seat upstairs? What about the Satanism?" And Sir Francis smiles and says, "Stuff of fiction." And John asks, "The infamous Black Masses at Medeham Abbey?" And Sir Francis answers, "All lies." And then John looks at him coyly and asks, "Even the orgies?" And Sir Francis answers, "Well, let's leave those aside for the moment. But for now, allow me to introduce my companions. The formidable Myrnar," and then he gestures to the cat person, and he continues, "and the unfortunate Bonardia." And then he points to the woman sitting in the chair. And John doesn't really acknowledge them. He just looks at Sir Francis and asks, "Where are the people who were in this room?" And Sir Francis answers, "Don't concern yourself over them just now, Mr. Constantine." And then Myrnar the cat person says, "I'll see about the stiff then." So Myrnar goes into Arthur's room. So John gets a cigarette, and as he lights it, he says, "Well, we've got our own cozy little Hellfire Club right here. Puss in Boots, the Venus de Milo, me, and innocent little Frankie Dashwood." And Sir Francis says, Mr. Constantine, my name was vilified by the scandalous and sarcastic fabrications of my contemporaries. A web of fiction linking all the important figures of my time in a variety of satanic conspiracies. And John takes a puff of his cigarette and says, What'd you expect? You were in politics. And Sir Francis says, Yes, perhaps I should allow that man's need to cast public figures as monstrous arch-villains has a long literary and journalistic tradition. And John puffs his cigarette again and says, We just love our political cover-ups and conspiracy theories. You should have been around 100 years later, mate. They'd be fitting you up now for Jack the Ripper's work. It would break our hearts to have to accept that a miserable little loony got a hold of a meat knife, slipped out of the gate when nobody was looking, and carved up the first person he met for no reason at all. And Sir Francis kind of angrily looks at John and says, Mr. Constantine, I find that the murdering of my reputation is perpetrated in your own times by gossip mongers posing as legitimate historians, and it has come to my ears that they have re-established a Hellfire Club here in London under my name, and that unspeakable atrocities are taking place there. And John puffs his cigarette again and asks, Such as, if you don't mind me inquiring. And Sir Francis tells him, A fool was found dead there, with a half-dead rodent in his rectum and proceeding to devour the internals. And John kind of looks at him unbelieving and says, A half-dead gerbil up his arse? Francis, who told you that one? And Sir Francis answers, A friend of a friend, both deceased. And John replies, It probably never happened, Sir Francis. It's one of those urban legends, the colorectal mouse. And Sir Francis asks, Urban legends? And John replies, Yeah, you know. Rumor elevated to modern myth, the vanishing hitchhiker, the choking Doberman, the severed fingers, Michael Jackson's telephone book. And just as John gives those examples of what an urban legend is, Myrnar walks out of Arthur's bedroom, and he is vigorously gnawing at a bloody bone. So it seems he had a snack of Arthur while he was in there. So as he gnaws on the bone, he says, Dashwood, haven't you got to the point yet? And John looks at him and says, That doesn't look like Kentucky Fried to me. And Sir Francis looks over at Myrnar and says, Oh no, Myrnar, you're not supposed to do this. And the woman in the chair, Bonadia, cuts in and says, Let him be. This is where civilized man's gone wrong, by suppressing the primitive in himself. And Myrnar cuts in saying, Listen to the pagan, Dashwood. That's what you always claimed to do. And then he goes back to gnawing on his bone and continues saying, People have been eating others for centuries. There is no instinctive aversion to it. And then Sir Francis cuts in, kind of changing the subject, and says, Mr. Constantine, we need help. Unspecifically, we need the help of one who can move with ease on this plane. Specifically, we need your help. We know you've had visions yourself of the unsettling things that are happening, and you have been witness to the visions of another, the one in the other room. And John says, kind of sarcastically, Sam's Uncle Arthur, bless his bleeding shin bone. And he's saying that because he's referencing the bone that Myrnar is chewing on. And he actually looks over at Myrnar and he asks, And what if I ain't interested? And Myrnar stops chewing and says, Remember that we have the parties who formerly awaited in this room. And John kind of calls his bluff and says, What if I don't give a fart? And Bonadia gets kind of mad and says, Oh, why do we resort to these tactics? Constantine, reality has been hacked in the middle with a machete. And then she stands up and gets in John's face and continues saying, The guts are about to start puking out. And then John kind of blows smoke in her face because he's still smoking, and he says, the delicate and alluring feminine approach. And as you can imagine, Bonadia is not happy about that, as she begins to yell at John, saying, Everything's going shitty. It's hidden now, but not for long. Then she kind of composes herself and continues saying, We need to cast a spell on an enormous scale. And Sir Francis cuts in saying, Bleed and bind, Mr. Constantine. We must play the physician and administer the remedies. It's a problem that hasn't come up before, Constantine. An occult's novelty. We know you can't resist that kind of thing. And John puffs his cigarette again and says, Oh yeah? Takes one to know one, Sir Francis? And Sir Francis smiles and says, Indeed. And then John looks over at Myrnar and says, Well, there's nothing on the box tonight anyway. Which echoes what he said to Sam when she asked him to come over for this in the first place. And obviously John is talking about the TV box here, like there's nothing on TV tonight. But Myrnar doesn't understand the saying, and he says, "What do you mean?" And John blows smoke in his face again and says, "It's just a saying, mate. Like, there's more than one way to skin a cat." And Myrnar doesn't like that answer or the smoke being blown in his face. So he goes over to one of the doors in the hall and he opens it and he says, "This man's giving me the ache. Let's finish here." Then he waves John inside and says, "There are your friends, Constantine. Safe, see?" And John approaches the doorway and looks inside, and he sees his friend Sam and some other relatives of hers that are sitting on the floor, bound and gagged. And John says to Myrnar, "Better leave them gagged. Otherwise, I'll have to explain the mess Uncle Arthur's in." Then John walks over to a telephone on a hallway table, and he says, "Let me make a call." So he dials, and then he waits for an answer, and someone picks up on the other line, and John replies, "Hey, Tosh, John Constantine. Can you do me a favor? Get over to Sam's place. Something's not right there. Yeah, the door should be open." Then he hangs up, and it seems like they all get ready to go, and Myrnar and Bonadia walk out of the house, and Sir Francis turns to John and says, "Bonadia and Myrnar will catch up with us later. I will accompany you on the first leg of our endeavor. We must start while the wound is fresh." And John replies, "Okay, but first I'm going to stop off at my place and pack a few things." So John begins to walk down the stairs to the front door, and Sir Francis is following behind him, and he says, "Mr. Constantine, I believe you are a fellow who understands things." And an annoyed John asks, "Are you on about the Hellfire Club again?" And Sir Francis replies, "Hellfire had nothing to do with it. It was a club like any other. Joseph Addison observed that man is a social animal. He takes all occasions and pretenses of forming those little nocturnal assemblies which are commonly known as clubs." And as John and Sir Francis get out the front door and walk outside, Sir Francis continues saying, "Addison's own club was the Kit Kat. Its members took upon themselves the pleasant task of nominating the prettiest debutante of each London season. To be known as the toast of the Kit Kat Club was a guarantee that a young lady would make an advantageous marriage." But just as he finishes his sentence, John cuts him off and yells, "Hold up." And then he points at something we can't see, and he says, "What's that coming down the street?" And Sir Francis looks where he's pointing, and as we turn the page, we see what looks like a mob of people overturning cars further down the block, and it looks like they have like torches in their hand. And also they seem to be dressed in 1700 style clothing. So thinking fast, John dives behind a car so the mob doesn't see him, and Sir Francis actually follows him, but he's standing like through the trunk because he's a ghost. And as John watches the mob destroy another car, he says, "Oh shit, that was Sam's car. This just ain't her day." And Sir Francis says, "Doomsday isn't anybody's day, Mr. Constantine." And as John watches the mob more, he realizes that it is not a normal mob. Obviously, they're wearing old school clothing, but all the people are moving as one, kind of like a school of fish or something. So John asks Sir Francis, "What is that thing?" And Sir Francis answers, "It's just the start, Mr. Constantine. That was the collective spirit of the old London mob. I fear it followed me to the mortal plane." And John lights a cigarette and says, "The ghost of a crowd. That's a new one on me." And Sir Francis replies, "The people never forgave me for introducing the liquor tax when I sat with the government." And I guess it seems like the mob isn't going to follow them, so John begins to casually walk the other way down the street, and Sir Francis follows him and says, "There are other dangers I cannot begin to warn you of. All the doors and gates that kept everything in its place have been flung open. Unreason has been let loose like a mad dog. We must hie away from here." And I had never heard that word hie, and apparently it's an old word that means quickly go. And one thing I love about this interaction between John and Sir Francis is John is just walking and Sir Francis is kind of always behind John. Like John doesn't really care that the ghost is there. He's just kind of going along with it. So without looking at Sir Francis, he says, "Right, I'm taking the tube then." So as they go to the subway entrance, Sir Francis says, "Do not fret about explaining my presence. I can be invisible to others if I choose." And as John goes down the stairs, he says, "Well, if you follow me down there, do me a favor and keep stum till we reach the other end. If I'm heard talking to myself, I'll be finishing my monologue in the nut house. Maybe I'll even be the next loony to get a hold of a meat knife." And as we turn the page, we cut to John's apartment, and we can see John is looking out the windows as if he was concerned that someone might be following them. And he says, "It occurs to me, Sir Francis, that if the crowd's after you, we shouldn't hang about too long in my flat. I don't want to be up for any more damage like." And Sir Francis replies, "Ah, those riotous commoners. Mr. Constantine, I hear that your modern crowds need a very serious incentive to get out of control." And John turns to him and says, "You mean like the poll tax?" And I'm not sure what that is. I'm assuming that is something political that was going on in England at the time. And Sir Francis answers, "Yes, but in my day, any old excuse would suffice. I am reminded of that fool Casanova, who complained bitterly around London when they upset his evening of watching the drama at Drury Lane. The king and queen were bustled out, and the mob were left to knock everything down except the four walls. And do you know why? Because the theater had raised their ticket prices. In the rest of Europe, a political police was in place to maintain order, but in England, where our commoners were renowned for their riots, social order rested upon more precarious foundations, namely, the delicate use of terror." And John lights a new cigarette, and he says, "Now there's a phrase to chew over." And Sir Francis goes on talking about the past, saying, "It was 1780, and I was an old man by this time. Lord Gorgon was whipping up public opinion in a campaign to oppress Roman Catholicism. The mob rioted, and the capital was treated to a week of looting, arson, and unchecked defiance of authority. On the third evening of the riots, Ned Dennis, executioner to the city of London, the last in my lifespan, was on his way home when he found himself midst a rabble wrecking a chandler's shop. Naturally, he got caught up in the reckless spirit of frenzied destruction, and alas, the fool was recognized by some of his fellows, and later he was seized by the militia outside the Blue Posts, an alehouse, on suspicion of being a ringleader. He was sentenced to death and confined at Totterfield's Bridewell to await his fate. That eventually, however, did not arise. You see, a great number of the rioters had been rounded up and had to be punished. Dennis, astoundingly, was the only man in town qualified to do the job." And I should say that all of this is narration right now, and we're seeing panels of what he's describing. So we're seeing a mob trash a chandler's shop, then we're seeing a man being arrested, then we're seeing that man sitting in a cell, then we see a bunch of prisoners with nooses around their neck who are about to be hung. And Sir Francis continues his story saying, "They had to reprieve him so that he could hang his fellow rioters. And hang them he did, in Bow Street and Bunhill Row, at Bishopsgate and Bloomsbury Square. But many of them he bungled, for his own narrow escape had undone his concentration." And under that narration, we see the executioner who was freed is having to pull on the legs of the men who are hanging so that their necks will snap. And I guess because of that, the mobs that were watching the executions begin to throw tomatoes at him. And Sir Francis continues, "I have often felt convinced that Dennis in that moment stared into the throat of chaos and saw that death is not the end of anything, that only feeble membranes separate life from death, the real from the unreal, the delicate power of terror from the tumult of revolt. And since then, men more intelligent than Dennis have envisioned the consequences of rupture in those membranes. Such as Arthur Shinbone in his bed of madness tonight." Then he looks at John kind of seriously and says, "Constantine, in the morning we must move." And John asks, "Where to?" And Francis replies, "West, the direction of death. Actually, Philadelphia." Then we cut to later that night as John is lying in his bed, and it seems he can't sleep, so he pulls out a cigarette and begins to smoke, and his narration says, "West. I'm in no hurry to go back that way again. Give me east any day, like Corfu and Crete. In a pinch, I'd even settle for Southend-on-Sea. But I'd go to Hellfire or Philadelphia, like Grandpa's old song says. Maybe I'm getting psychic right enough. Me crystal ball says this is going to be a round trip. All around. Me and Carpet Fluff. We're always being sucked in. It's me fate. No getting out of it. Beats clocking in every day at a coat hanger factory, though." Then we cut to the next day, I guess, where John is on a plane, and the narration says, "We got on a flight quicker than I expected. I hope I don't have to go through explaining aeroplanes to Dashwood again." Then we hear the flight attendant come on and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret that there will be a delay in our departure for New York due to our pilot's sudden illness." Then a man comes running down the aisle and says, "Wait a minute. I'll fly the plane. It'll be not a bother. Let me up there, hen." And John gets very alarmed by this and he says, "Oh, God, no." But the old lady sitting next to him says, "It's only a joke, son. Look, striped trousers. That man's really the pilot." So John looks over and sees that the man does in fact have striped pants, which I guess is the uniform of pilots. And if you ask me, that is a bad joke to play if you're a pilot. And I guess the old lady saying that did reassure John, because his narration says, "Ha, I fell for that one like a naughty angel. It's good to start a flight off with a bit of a laugh. Life's dangerous enough without us trying to imitate the birds." Then we turn the page and we cut to New York, and John is walking with Sir Francis by his side again. And it seems like they're in the international terminal. They haven't left yet because they have to go through immigration. So John turns to Sir Francis, and it seems like John has been thinking about the gag that the pilot pulled during the whole flight. And he says to Francis, "This is something of a coincidence. Did you notice that gag the pilot pulled back there?" And Sir Francis replies, "Indeed, yes. I have quite an appetite myself for the well-crafted practical joke." And John says, "Well, never mind that. It's another one of those urban legends I was telling you about." And Sir Francis says, "How curious. Mr. Constantine, I have a bad feeling about this. The supernatural forces which writhe compressed at the heart of things can be most inventive in finding release back here on the mortal plane, almost as though they possessed intelligence." But John cuts him off and says, "Hold up, Francis." And we can see John is staring at something intensely. And we see what he's staring at is a woman who's going through a metal detector at immigration, and it's going off, and the security guards have brought dogs over to her to sniff her for drugs, I guess, and they are barking uncontrollably. And the woman is holding a baby, and the baby is perfectly quiet. And John looks at this and says, "Hey, you'd think that baby would be crying." And then one of the dogs jumps up and hits the baby out of the woman's arm, and the baby falls down, and John says, "Oh, bloody hell." And then a crowd gathers around, obviously, to try to help the baby, but it doesn't move. In fact, the baby actually split open, and luckily we don't see any of that. We just see John trying to get a look through the crowd, and he can hear people yelling, "The baby's dead! It's stitched up the back! Get the dog off! Get the goddamn dog off! Hey man, that baby's full of drugs! I'm gonna be sick!" And John pushes his way past once he hears all this, just in time to see one of the dogs lunge up and grab the arm of the woman who was holding the baby. And Sir Francis follows him and asks, "A dead infant?" And John replies, "Packed full of drugs." And Sir Francis gets really excited because he thinks he's figured it out, and he asks, "Is this an urban legend too?" And John is actually in so much shock at what he's seeing that he has to cover his mouth in awe, and he answers Francis's question saying, "Yeah, no, Francis. It's just horrible." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So we'll have to see what happens with all that in the next one. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see y'all in the next one.